Here is how to answer Apple's top 7 most commonly asked and important interview questions in 2026. And I want you to notice, while lists of interview questions are so easy to build, what's not as straightforward is to understand what's a good versus a great interview answer. The first interview question would be, why Apple? This is one of the most commonly asked interview questions and should be top priority for any candidate. What makes a great answer to why Apple? Some of the best I've heard from senior executives were motivational type of answers. People who can speak well can put together a great motivational pitch, and this would be the most impactful. However, not everyone can speak well, can build motivational speeches, in which case I would very much advise you to focus on clarity, on communicating your idea, your why Apple, as clearly as possible. Find 2 or 3 reasons for which you believe you'd be the best bet for them, and try communicating them as a means to sell yourself when compared to building a motivational speech. Okay? Now, if you would be looking for some time-saving tips here, usually you can prepare your tell me about yourself, which by the way goes hand in hand as being the top most commonly asked interview question, with the why Apple. So if you put these two together, you'll be able to save yourself quite a bit of time during interview prep. If you would like to prepare a behavioral interview using the most qualitative approach, such as to build a story bank, which you would roleplay, then I would advise you as a time-saving tip to prepare why Apple and tell me about yourself last. Because what happens is once you have your behavioral stories, it will be a piece of cake for you to come up with an elevator pitch and with the why Apple. All right, so prepare them together, tell me about yourself and why Apple, and prepare them last, not first, if you choose to build a story bank. The second interview question I want to talk about here would be, tell me about one of your projects or programs, depending on the role that you're applying for. So this would be an easy interview question. Why would it be so efficient in job interviews? It's an extremely efficient interview question because the interviewer would almost always get a sense as the type of subject matter expert that you are. The most common example is for PM roles. By sharing your best story, so to speak, you would give them an idea on whether you're a hands-on or a hands-off PM, which, is critically important when applying for a role to match that level of seniority that they are expecting from the ideal candidate. Also, another very common use case for this interview question would be as in the context of a deep dive test. In other words, they would follow up with challenge questions, trying to gain a deeper understanding on whether you actually owned that project or program. And here the best approach to have a great interview would be to focus on making brain dumps for your core experiences, for your core stories while preparing for a job interview, because this is the safest way to ensure that you will be able to remember all the critically important details that you would like to share with them when talking about these stories, but also you will minimize the risk of raising suspicions about the ownership over that project or program. Many candidates like to come up with metrics they didn't own, or even invent those metrics, or decisions that they weren't fully responsible for, to look a bit more senior. So if you make those brain dumps, you will eliminate these risks. Okay, so what's your best story? It's a very common interview question, but it's a very revealing type of question. And maybe one more note here about this, tell me about one of your projects or program. This is also revealing as to your qualitative standards. Okay, so by sharing your highlights in your career and by the way you sell it to your interviewer, they will form a picture of you, whether you are someone with high standards or high enough standards for an Apple interview, right? The third question I want to talk about here: when is the last time when you disagreed with someone? So why would someone ask you this in a job interview about a disagreement? Because they want to see how you deal with conflict, okay? Conflict inside your team, right? So they are not interested in how you deal with conflict outside work. They are not interested in how you deal with conflict when to be necessarily the most recent conflict. Notice the framing of the question is slightly counterintuitive on purpose, because I wanted to highlight that it's important that you read a little bit between the lines of these interview questions. They're basically asking you, what's the best conflict story you can share with me today? And what happens is, a very common mistake candidates make is to talk about a conflict rather reactively. Hey, what conflict can I remember about at first? And you'll be surprised how many times that conflict will not play to your advantage, because let's be real here, let's be clear, we all have conflicts that we cannot easily get over with. You know, it could be, if I bring this to an extreme, maybe you got into a conflict with your manager and they pushed you out of your previous team or previous job even. So you wouldn't want to necessarily talk about these types of situations in job interviews. But what's really efficient here as an approach would be to focus on building trust. Okay, sell yourself as someone able to build trust internally in your team. Whenever you have a disagreement with someone, most roles will be interested in having a twofold approach. First, you want to come up with the data, you know, with facts, with factual information to prove your point, and the second, using some great communication. And you would then focus on diffusing that functional conflict, right? A functional conflict refers to a disagreement with respect to something that your subject matter area of expertise, right? When compared to talking about non-functional conflicts, such as that guy did not like me. Okay, very few roles. For very few roles, it would make sense to talk about such situations. Okay. Question number 4 I want to talk about here. Tell me about the time when you laid out a vision when there wasn't one. So this interview question is most appropriate for more senior types of roles. For example, for a director of procurement, laying out a vision could be about supply chains, redundancy, or bringing down cost in those supply chains. For a senior PM, it could be about something innovative. You know, when you designed a product, program, or solution, you used innovation for that. So laying out a vision means very different things to different types of roles. And this type of question can also be used as, tell me about one of your projects, in order to drill down, to deep dive into your subject matter expertise within this context of you being a visionary, right? Someone innovative. Innovation plays well in most roles when selling yourself as someone visionary, right? Notice this backwards looking. It's still a behavioral interview question. You would still have to pitch it in the STAR format. You would still want to use maybe some learnings, but the basics are there, right? Question number 5. What's your favorite Apple product or service? Okay, so this is a pretty standard interview question in Apple interviews, and there's 2 ways you can go around this. First way, if you have an interest to sell yourself on something here, you know, if you're a product manager, if you're an IT product manager, so to speak, you have all the interest in the world to pitch one of Apple's products and maybe link it to one of your achievements, or maybe even your vision as to how you would improve those, right? So if it makes sense to you, you could pitch this interview question and sell yourself on it as a great candidate. But if the role that you're applying for is, I don't know, maybe an accountant, then you have not much benefit to sell yourself on any of Apple's products, right? So you can generally talk about a situation. Maybe you use a MacBook, you love it a lot better than the Windows one because, you know, it works. It works at all times. Okay, but still preparing these pretty easy interview question in advance will put you in a better spot to answer these well. Question number 6, tell me about the time when you failed. So this question used to be less popular 5 years ago, but now everyone seems to be preparing for to talk about failure and about shortcomings in job interviews. Why would this be so efficient in this to ask someone about failure in job interviews? That's a classic test to see if someone prepared for the job interview, because if you hear this question for the first time, you'll likely block or not really know how to pitch this, right? So how do you pitch a failure? Well, first, let me predict that it will take you 3 attempts until you'll find a great failure story that you can sell yourself during a job interview. What's the best way to sell yourself with a failure, with a shortcoming in a job interview? Through its learnings. So 50% of your failure story should be learnings, how you grew from that experience. Needless to say, the failure must be an amazing learning opportunity for you. It doesn't have to be something that would damage you or your candidate during a job interview, such as you failed in your last role and you got laid off, and here you are interviewing with Apple. Or another questionable answer would be, hey, I failed my previous job application with whatever company. You know, that is not gonna work yet, right? So you must use something from your professional context, right? And the 7th interview question, I think it's well worth preparing for an Apple interview, is how do you influence cross-functionally? This is again a question targeted to more senior types of roles, but still cross-functional communication is an important aspect of day-to-day jobs for many types of roles. And what does it mean to communicate or to influence cross-functionally? Cross-functionally means basically when you're dealing with people that are not on the same subject area of expertise such as yours. It may mean you collaborate with someone upwards in hierarchy or downwards. Okay, so in my training program, the example I like to give is one from a VP of IT in a bank, when they noticed that employees in the bank used a conferencing software which was pretty outdated, and basically everyone was wasting a lot of time. It was unreliable, and they wanted to shift everyone. They want to shift everyone in the bank from using that old conferencing software to how is that called? Zoom. Okay, so they wanted to shift everyone to Zoom. However, their first attempt, to tell everyone, hey, you know what, would be nice if you moved on Zoom to do your conferences, no one listened to them when they tried it this way. So what they did instead was to speak to 10 other executives of the bank and bring them to a pilot project into which all their internal meetings would be held via Zoom instead of the older conferencing software. And he managed to bring 9 out of 10 those executives in, and this is when they, improved their results in influencing the adoption of Zoom as a conferencing software in their bank. So notice here the cross-functional communication. First, you try to directly communicate with the employees. It didn't work out very well, but then you chose to do a pilot with 10 other executives, and you basically forced them. Well, you didn't force them, you influenced them without authority, but still this is how you managed to bring up adoption for this conferencing software. So this is how you go about influencing cross-functionally. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.